So we're going to be looking at structures associated with the respiratory system, and these would be the pair of lungs in the thoracic cavity. The heart sits between the lungs in a space known as the mediastinum. Because the heart is angled to the left, there's a notch in the left lung called the cardiac notch. Each of the lungs consist of lobes. So the right lung has 3 lobes separated by 2 fissures: superior, middle, and inferior lobes. The left lung has a fissure that divides it into 2 lobes, a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. The lungs rest on top of the diaphragm, which is the skeletal muscle that serves as the major muscle of respiration between the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. So when we look up here, this would be the external nares, sometimes called the anterior nares. We would probably just call it a nostril. And it leads into the nasal cavity. At the end of the nasal cavity would be an opening into the pharynx of the throat called the internal nares, sometimes called the posterior nares. Just below the chin is your larynx, often called the voice box. The larynx is bigger, more prominent in males, and sometimes referred to as the Adam's apple. The blue color here would be the hyaline cartilage that gives rigidity to the wall of the larynx. And if you feel just beneath your chin, you can feel the larynx. So just below the larynx is the orange colored thyroid gland, and it sits on top of the trachea, which is your windpipe. So we don't see much of the trachea until it gets down to where it ends, and it ends behind the heart. So I'm going to take off the tops of each of these lungs and remove the heart. And when I do, you can see the end of the trachea or windpipe just behind the heart. The blue plates that you see in the wall of the trachea and the bronchi would be plates of hyaline cartilage that make the walls of these tubes rigid so they don't collapse when you inhale. The trachea begins right here behind the thyroid gland. It's an extension of the larynx. The larynx becomes the trachea, and the trachea ends here. And then the trachea branches into 2 short primary bronchi, one to each lung. So there's a primary bronchus to the right lung and a primary bronchus to the left lung. The primary bronchi enter the lungs at what's called the hilus. And that's kind of in the middle of the medial side of each lung. The medial side would be the side that faces the mediastinum. Once a primary bronchus enters the lungs, it branches repeatedly into a network of bronchi that are collectively called the bronchial tree. The blood vessels that you see here in the lungs are those of the pulmonary circuit, where the pulmonary arteries would be colored blue and the pulmonary veins colored red. If you look on the surface of the lobes of the lung, you'll see these roughly hexagonal tracings, and they represent units of each lung lobe called a lung lobule. And we're going to be looking at a model of a lung lobule in just a minute. So this is a model that shows details of the upper respiratory tract. So again, here would be an external nares or anterior nares. That's a nostril that leads into the nasal cavity. At the end of the nasal cavity would be the internal or posterior nares, and that's an opening at the end of the nasal cavity into the pharynx or your throat. So within each nasal cavity are 3 ridges of bone called conchi. There's a superior, middle, and inferior conchi. The nasal cavities are surrounded by 4 bones. And there are mucous membrane-lined air-filled cavities in each of those 4 bones called paranasal sinuses. So these bones include the frontal, sphenoid, temporal, and maxillary bones. We can see a couple of the paranasal sinuses on this mid-sagittal cut through the head and the neck. This would be a frontal sinus, and these are sphenoid sinuses in the sphenoid bone. So the nasal cavity is separated by the oral cavity, where the tongue is found, by a palate. And the palate has 2 parts to it. There's a hard or bony part called the hard palate, and it's made up of the maxillary and palatine bones. And then at the end of the hard palate would be an arch of muscle that makes up the soft palate. The very tip of the soft palate is known as the uvula. This right here would be the pharynx, or your throat, and there's 3 sections to the pharynx. The nasopharynx. Behind the mouth is the oropharynx, and then next to the larynx would be the laryngopharynx. And then the pharynx eventually gives rise to the esophagus, which goes down behind the heart in the thoracic cavity through the diaphragm and opens up into the stomach. This here is the larynx, and the blue color would be the hyaline cartilage that makes up the rigid walls of the larynx. Within the larynx, you'll see 2 white stripes, and those are the vocal cords. It's the lower white stripe that is referred to as a true vocal cord. There'd be 2 of those, 1 on each side. They vibrate as you exhale to create sound. And then you modify that sound by moving or wiggling your tongue into intelligible words. Every time you speak, you exhale, and you have to move your tongue. You might try speaking while inhaling, and try speaking without moving your tongue, and chances are you're not going to be able to create sounds that anyone would be able to understand. So there is a flap reinforced internally by elastic cartilage called the epiglottis. Epi means on top of, and it's on top of an opening here called the glottis, which is an opening on the side of the laryngopharynx into the larynx. When you swallow food or something that you've been drinking, the uvula swings up and the epiglottis swings down over the glottis, and when you swallow, that uvula swinging up and the epiglottis swinging down directs food and liquids down the pharynx into the esophagus on its way to the stomach. So let's take a closer look at a lung lobule. So again, when you look at the surface of the lung, you can see the fissures that divide the lung into lobes. And then there are these roughly hexagonal tracings associated with each lobe. And they would be a tracing associated with a lung lobule. So the lung lobules make up the lobes of the lung. And this is a lung lobule. Within the lungs are air tubes that branch repeatedly. This tube right here is a bronchus with plates of blue-colored hyaline cartilage in its wall to keep the walls rigid so they don't collapse as you inhale. And the bronchi is plural, bronchus with a US at the end is singular. And the bronchi branch into small diameter tubes, usually less than a millimeter in diameter, called bronchioles. The bronchioles are surrounded by smooth muscle cells that are represented as pink or salmon-colored stripes on the model. The smooth muscle cells can contract and relax to control the diameter of the bronchioles and in turn control how much air can go into and out of the lungs. So if these smooth muscle cells contract, that's bronchoconstriction, and the diameter of those small tubes gets smaller and you can only move X amount of air into and out of the lungs. When you exercise, the smooth muscle will relax and that increases the diameter of those bronchioles. As a result, you can move, that would be bronchodilation, and you can move more air into and out of the lung. So the bronchioles feed air into what are referred to as the alveolar sacs, and many alveolar sacs make up a lung lobule. So each alveolar sac is made up of 20 to 30 alveoli. The number varies. And what you're looking at here would be an alveolar sac here. Here's an alveolar sac. Here's another alveolar sac, another alveolar sac, and another one. So this lung lobule, at least on this side of it, is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 alveolar sacs, where each alveolar sac consists of these individual bubble-like structures, which would be the alveoli or air sacs. So alveoli, when spelled with an I on the end, is plural. If you change the I on the end to a US, it becomes alveolus, and that's the singular form. An alveolus is also called an air sac. Each of the alveoli of an air sac is covered by its own pulmonary capillary bed. The pulmonary capillaries are the site of gas exchange. So the pulmonary capillaries are where the blood capillaries take up oxygen that's come in as you inhale and get rid of the carbon dioxide. Because carbon dioxide is a gaseous waste product of cellular respiration. You got to get rid of it, and you do that by taking it to the lungs, then exhaling it out of the body. The blood supply to the pulmonary capillaries is by way of the blue-colored pulmonary arteries, and the blue-colored pulmonary arteries ultimately feed blue-colored pulmonary arterioles that feed blood into the pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange occurs. And the pulmonary capillaries are drained by red-colored pulmonary venules that eventually deliver blood into red-colored pulmonary veins. The lungs are the only organs in the body that receive blood from the pulmonary circuit, which is exclusive to the lungs. But they also receive blood from the systemic circuit as well. So there are arteries that come off the aorta, called bronchial arteries, that deliver systemic blood into the lungs. So if I flip this around, you'll see down here in the wall of the lungs a capillary bed that's not covering any alveoli. And as a result, we know that that is a capillary bed that is a systemic capillary network. And it would be fed by red-colored systemic arterioles and drained by blue-colored systemic venules. These alveoli are covered with capillary networks And beneath the capillary networks are networks of elastic fibers. The elastic fibers are shown on this model as a network of black fibers. So you can't show the capillaries and the fibers together. So on this model, these would be the pulmonary capillaries, and over here on these alveoli in black would be the network of elastic fibers associated with each alveolus, because there are elastic fibers throughout the lungs, and that gives them a tremendous amount of elasticity.